Sammy Davis Jr. was diagnosed with throat cancer in August 1989. The irony was cruel. The man whose voice had entertained millions, who could sing, mimic, joke, and charm better than anyone alive, was losing the very thing that defined him. The cancer started as a small tumor on his vocal cords. By the time it was discovered, it had already spread. The doctors gave him radiation treatment, but it was too late. The cancer was aggressive, merciless. By early 1990, Sammy knew he was dying. Frank Sinatra couldn't accept it. Frank had already lost so many people. His mother, Dolly, in a plane crash. Ava Gardner, the love of his life, to distance and time. Dean's son, Dino. Frank was 74 years old, and he was watching his world shrink. When Sammy's condition worsened in May 1990, Frank made a decision. He was going to be there. He was going to sit with his brother until the end. He checked into a hotel near Cedars-Sinai and spent every waking moment at Sammy's bedside. Sammy appreciated Frank's presence, but he could see what it was doing to him. Frank looked exhausted. His face was drawn. His eyes were red from crying. Sammy wanted to tell Frank to go home, to take care of himself, but Sammy could barely speak anymore. The cancer and the radiation had destroyed his throat. Communication happened through whispers and written notes. On May 15th, Frank was sitting in Sammy's room holding his hand when Sammy's wife, Altavis, came in with unexpected news. "Dean's here." Frank looked up sharply. "What?" "Dean Martin. He's downstairs. He wants to see Sammy." Frank couldn't believe it. Dean hadn't left his house in Beverly Hills in months. After his son, Dean Paul, died in 1987, Dean had withdrawn from the world completely. He'd stopped performing, stopped socializing, stopped being Dean Martin. Frank had tried to reach out, but Dean had built walls that nobody could penetrate, and now Dean was here. Frank went down to the hospital lobby and found Dean standing awkwardly near the elevators. Dean looked old. He'd lost weight. His famous swagger was gone, but his eyes, usually so guarded, were full of pain and determination. "Dean," Frank said, his voice breaking, "I can't believe you came. How is he?" Frank shook his head. "Not good. Maybe a few days, maybe less." Dean nodded slowly. "Can I see him?" "Of course." Frank led Dean to Sammy's room. When they walked in, Sammy's eyes opened. He'd been dozing, but he seemed to sense Dean's presence. Sammy tried to sit up, but he was too weak. Dean walked to the bedside and pulled up a chair. He took Sammy's hand. "Hey, Smokey, it's me." Sammy's face broke into a smile. Even dying, even in unbearable pain, Sammy Davis Jr. could still smile. He mouthed the word Dean, but no sound came out. "I know, buddy. I know." Dean's voice was gentle. "I'm sorry I haven't been around. I've been dealing with my own stuff, but I'm here now." Sammy squeezed Dean's hand weakly. Frank watched from the doorway, tears streaming down his face. This was it. This was the last time the three of them would be together. The core of the Rat Pack reduced to this: one dying, one broken, one trying desperately to hold it together. Dean looked at Sammy for a long moment, and then he started talking. He didn't talk about cancer. He didn't talk about death. He talked about the old days. "Remember that night in Vegas in '59? Dean said. "We were at the Sands, and you did that impression of me doing an impression of you." Frank laughed so hard he fell off his chair. Sammy's smile grew wider. His eyes were sparkling despite the pain. Remember when we shot Ocean's 11? You kept trying to teach Frank how to dance, but Frank has 2 left feet." Frank, listening from the doorway, let out a choked laugh. Dean continued, weaving stories of their decades together. The Rat Pack tours, the recording sessions, the practical jokes, the late-night conversations when the audiences had gone home and it was just 3 friends talking about life. Dean talked for an hour. His voice was steady, warm, filled with the love he usually kept hidden beneath his cool exterior. Sammy couldn't respond verbally, but he didn't need to. His eyes said everything. Finally, Dean leaned in close. He whispered something in Sammy's ear, something private, something meant only for Sammy. Frank couldn't hear what Dean said. Altavaz, standing in the corner, couldn't hear it either. But whatever it was, Sammy's reaction was immediate. Tears poured down his face. Not tears of sadness, but tears of something else. Peace, maybe, gratitude, love. Dean pulled back and looked at Sammy. Sammy nodded, still crying, and mouthed the words, "Thank you." Dean kissed Sammy's forehead, something he'd never done in all their years of friendship. Then he stood up and walked toward the door. Frank followed Dean into the hallway. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Frank asked, "What did you say to him?" Dean's eyes were wet. "I told him I'd see him again. That when my time comes, whenever that is, I'll find him. And we'll do the whole thing over. The jokes, the songs, the laughs, all of it." Frank stared at Dean. "You believe that?" "I have to," Dean said quietly, "because the alternative, the idea that this is it, that we'll never see Sammy again, that's too much to bear." And then Dean said something that shattered Frank's composure completely. "I told him to save me a seat next to Dino. Tell him his old man is coming eventually, and when I get there, we'll all be together again. The Rat Pack plus my boy. One big happy family. Frank Sinatra, the man who'd stared down mobsters, who'd commanded presidents, who'd never backed down from anything, collapsed against the wall and sobbed. Deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place of pure grief. Dean put his arm around Frank and held him while he cried. They stood in that hospital hallway for 10 minutes. 2 old men who'd conquered the world now facing the one thing they couldn't defeat: death. Eventually, Frank composed himself. "I can't lose him, Dean. I can't lose another one." "I know," Dean said, "but we don't get to choose. All we can do is be here. Be with him until the end. You did that, Frank. You've been here every day. That matters." Frank wiped his eyes. "Will you come back?" Dean hesitated. His instinct was to say no, to retreat back to his fortress in Beverly Hills, but he looked at Frank, saw the desperation in his friend's eyes, and nodded. "I'll come back tomorrow." Dean kept his promise. He came back the next day and the day after that. For the final 5 days of Sammy Davis Jr.'s life, Dean Martin made the drive from Beverly Hills to Cedars-Sinai every afternoon. He'd sit with Sammy for an hour or 2, telling stories, holding his hand, being present. Frank was there every day, too. The 2 of them, the surviving core of the Rat Pack, keeping vigil over their dying brother. On May 16, 1990, at 5:59 in the morning, Sammy Davis Jr. died. He was 64 years old. Frank was in the room when it happened. He'd fallen asleep in the chair next to Sammy's bed and woke up to find Sammy gone. Frank called Dean at home. Dean answered on the first ring as if he'd been waiting for the call. "He's gone," Frank said, His voice was hollow. Dean was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm coming over." When Dean arrived at the hospital, Frank was sitting in the hallway, staring at nothing. Dean sat down next to him. They didn't speak for a long time. Finally, Frank said, "What you told him about seeing him again, do you really believe that?" Dean looked at his friend. "I have to, Frank, because the alternative is unbearable." Frank nodded. "I want to believe it too." "Then believe it," Dean said. "Believe that Sammy's somewhere right now, probably tap dancing and making God laugh. Believe that Dino's there with him, teaching him how to fly jets. Believe that when our time comes, they'll be waiting for us." Frank looked at Dean with red, swollen eyes. "How do you do it? How do you keep going after losing Dino?" "I don't," Dean admitted. "I'm not keeping going. I'm just existing, waiting. But being here these past few days, being with you and Sammy, that's the first time I've felt alive since my son died. So maybe that's the answer. We keep going by being there for each other." Sammy Davis Jr.'s funeral was held on May 18, 1990. It was a massive event. Celebrities, politicians, fans, everyone came to say goodbye to Mr. Entertainment. Frank Sinatra delivered the eulogy. His voice shook, but he got through it. He talked about Sammy's talent, his courage, his generosity. He talked about what Sammy had meant to him personally. And at the end, Frank said something that made everyone in the church look at Dean Martin. "Sammy once told me that Dean Martin was the kindest man he'd ever known, that beneath the cool exterior was a heart bigger than any of us realized." I didn't fully understand what Sammy meant until these past few days. Dean, thank you for being there. Thank you for showing me how to say goodbye with grace. Dean, sitting in the front row, kept his eyes down. He didn't want the attention. He'd come to honor Sammy, not to be honored himself. After the funeral, Frank pulled Dean aside. "I mean it. What you did, coming to the hospital, being there, it saved me. I couldn't have gotten through it without you." "You would have been fine," Dean said. "No," Frank insisted. "I wouldn't have. I was falling apart. But watching you, seeing how you handled it, that gave me strength." Dean didn't know what to say. He'd been operating on instinct, doing what felt right. He hadn't realized Frank was drawing strength from him. Frank continued, "We're the last two, Dean. Joey's gone, Peter's gone, Sammy's gone. It's just us now." Dean nodded. "I know." Frank's voice cracked. "Promise me something. Promise me we won't let this be the end. Promise me we'll stay in touch, that we won't drift apart like everyone else." Dean looked at his oldest friend and made a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. "I promise, Frank." For the next 5 years, until Dean's death in 1995, Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin talked on the phone regularly. Not long conversations. Dean wasn't capable of that anymore. But short check-ins. "How are you doing? I'm here if you need anything." When Dean died on Christmas Day 1995, Frank was devastated. He'd lost his last brother. The Rat Pack was truly finished. At Dean's funeral, Frank tried to deliver a eulogy but couldn't get through it. He broke down crying and had to sit down. Later, Frank told Dean's daughter Deanna something he'd never told anyone else. "In those final days at the hospital with Sammy, your father saved my life. Not literally, but spiritually. He showed me how to face loss with dignity. how to be present for someone you love even when it breaks your heart. He gave me 5 more days with Sammy that I'll treasure forever. Deanna asked, "What did he whisper to Sammy? What did he say that made you break down?" Frank smiled through his tears. He told Sammy he'd see him again, that death wasn't the end, that their friendship would continue on the other side. And hearing Dean say that, this man who'd lost his own son and was drowning in grief, hearing him offer Sammy that comfort, that hope, it destroyed me. Because I realized Dean was the strongest person I'd ever known. Not because he wasn't hurting, but because he was hurting more than any of us, and he still found the strength to comfort someone else. The story of Dean Martin's final days with Sammy Davis Jr. isn't well known. It happened privately, away from cameras and reporters. But for those who were there, for Frank Sinatra and Altavis Davis and the nurses who witnessed it, Dean's presence during those final days was a master class in friendship, in how to show up when it's hard, how to offer comfort when you're broken yourself, how to love someone enough to sit with them while they die. That's the real Dean Martin legacy. Not the songs or the movies or the cool persona, but the quiet moments when he chose compassion over self-preservation, when he showed up for people who needed him, when he whispered hope into the ear of a dying friend and made that friend believe, just for a moment, that death wasn't the end, that somewhere, somehow, they'd all be together again.